Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for coming out tonight to the launch of this very exciting anthology, This Arab is Queer. I should confess I'm not an Arab, but I am queer, so I'm half qualified for this evening. My name is Paul Burston. I'm an author and a journalist, and I also run Polari Literary Salon. For those who don't know, we've been running since 2007, and we're a live platform for LGBTQ+ literary talent. We also run 2 book prizes for established and emerging writers. And I'm very pleased that 2 of our past Polari Prize winners are included in this wonderful anthology, Amru Al-Qadi and Salim Haddad. I'd like to introduce the editor of the anthology, Elias Jahshan, and also... Woo! Feeling the love already. And sitting next to me is Anbara Salam, one of the contributors. I've been given a couple of suggested topics to start us talking, but I'm happy to go with the flow and see where these guys want to go with the conversation. But I think we should start with one of the topics that was suggested by your publisher, which I think is a really good one, which is, this is now Pride Month. What does this mean beyond the Western world and what we think of Pride here? What does it mean to you guys, Pride Month? Would you like to go first? As the editor.
I've been mulling this question over my mind for the past few days and how can I best possibly answer this. And I really don't know what the best answer is. Because I just feel like I grew up in the West and I was born and raised in the West. So my idea of Pride is very different to what our queer community would feel it is in the Middle East and North Africa itself. So I think for me to answer that would be really, really tricky because I don't want to, it's not my place to speak over them or speak for them. The community in Southwest Asia, North Africa, they've got their own agency, they can speak for themselves. But I think, I think what we have to keep in mind is that Pride in the West is, it's almost got like a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to coming out. It's almost like, coming out is the only way to be get your true queer self. Whereas in Southwest Asia, North Africa, that's not necessarily the case. The whole concept of coming out is very much a Western concept. It doesn't work for a lot of people in the Arab community. And there are many, many reasons for that. It's not just religion, it's lots of politics involved, stigmas involved, class and socioeconomic status. It all plays a part into that. So Pride for them, it'd be very, very different to compared to what Pride is for us in the West. And for us, we've got the privilege to be able to march in the streets and to be able to be loud and proud about it and have the safety, the security in knowing that we can do that safely. Whereas even in places like Beirut, which is famous for having a queer visible scene, very visible queer scene there and community, every time they try to have a Pride parade, it's always got some controversy around it, always got a negative backlash, and it tends to sort of stop it from happening. I don't have to talk about what every other major city. We only just saw last week in Turkey, there was a Pride parade and the police came in and attacked people trying to do a Pride parade. So I think in the Southwest Asia and North Africa, we have to be conscious of the fact that they've got circumstances there which it does make it harder, but like I said before, I really want to stress the fact that I'm speaking from an experience of someone who comes from the West, so I don't know if I've got the authority to,
That was much more eloquently put than I'm going to manage. But I mean, I agree. Also, I'm a diasporic Arab living in the West, born in the West, grew up in the West, and so my kind of experience and an interpretation of what Pride and like the Pride Month particularly means is very different. I don't know that I can really extrapolate that into the Swana region and how that the importance of that kind of that visibility, celebration, education is something that we really can't underestimate, even at the most kind of symbolic level. Because, I mean, again, as I was reflecting on this, I was thinking about how much of queer identity is actually policed at the the symbolic or the semiotic level. And so even on this very surface engagement with queer radical identities, queer joy, and queer history that I interpret from Pride Month personally, I think there's so much value that could be had at that very, very shallow level. But I also feel personally that there is an entanglement, still an uncomfortable entanglement with kind of institutional and corporate pinkwashing, even in the West. So if this is something that we haven't really grappled with, in Europe, in UK, in the States, what kind of expectations can we have for similar mapping onto articulating this in the Swana region? I don't have an answer for that. I think it's really uncomfortable. There is an uncomfortable tension there, I think. But ultimately, my hope is that we will, with a bit more deeper interrogation, that this is something that we will see more of in the Swana region as we become more comfortable having conversations, the kind of conversations that this book is actually trying to begin.
I was speaking to somebody before we began. I'm old enough to remember when Pride wasn't the way that it is now, and there weren't police marching along in rainbow laces. They were actually beating us up. So I'm just wondering whether part of it is also, timing and the moment in history, and whether things are going to shift and change as well, because Pride here was a protest, and it's only relatively recently that it's become this kind of corporate bloated thing, which I personally don't feel, I don't feel that it reflects my life whatsoever, to be honest with you. But the Prides that I used to attend did, because they felt like my life, So I wonder whether part of it is as communities become more vocal and come out or not, but they become more vocal. And I think books like this are part of that conversation. They're a huge part of it, actually. So maybe there's change in the air. Maybe things will. Maybe if I asked you this question in 5 years' time, the answer will be different.
I would personally like to believe that there is change in the air. Just judging from just gauging the discourse coming out of Southwest Asia and North Africa, and there's a lot more vocal allies coming forward to speak for the community. There's a lot more queer people themselves coming out and being vocal about their identity and living their true selves in the public eye. So I do want to believe that there's definitely change in the air, and I think we have to believe there's change in the air because it's a positive change. But with that, there's the risk of more negative backlash because these institutions, these governments, they use queer bodies, they use queer identity as an excuse to push forward, awful policies. I don't know where to begin, but we've got Egypt as a prime example. Sisi there constantly uses the queer community as a political football to distract from the wider issues of what's happening in Egypt, such as inflation and poverty and what have you. And what Sisi does is really brutal. But at the same time, there's definitely there's an underground queer community no matter where you go in the Middle East. Just saying underground just sounds wrong. Because they are there, they exist no matter what. They're above ground, It's stupid. It's really. I don't know why. I just feel I've got to unlearn saying that. But the community across the Arab world and North Africa the queer community does exist, and they exist in their own special, different ways. And I think it's a matter of knowing how to find that community, how to connect with other people in that community and make a community amongst yourselves and be in that community and be yourself in that community, which I would like to think that is their version of Pride, but like I said, it's not my place to say. And whereas for us, it's a lot easier to just walk out on the street and go to a gay bar and wham, bam, thank you, man, just meet someone, take them home, whatever, But I think in the Arab world, it's just a lot different. I'm just rambling right now, so.
I think also there's always has been and there still is a huge difference in the experience of men and women. And, right now there is, I used to edit the, it was then called the LGBT section at the time I left, but originally it was called the gay section back in the day of Time Out. And the number of women's venues compared to men's venues was always tiny. And now there are virtually none, as far as I'm aware. So it's like, where are you meant to go and find this community, you know, if there's nowhere for you to go? What does an Arab queer community mean to each of you? What does that expression, what does that phrase mean to you?
For me, I guess my identity, my self-discovery as a queer Arab or a gay Arab man goes back to when I was living in Sydney in my 20s. I was newly single from my previous relationship, and I discovered this party in Sydney called Club Ara, which literally means club sweat or club, you know, the drink of Ara, however you want to interpret it. And it's basically an Arabic music party for the queer community, and it was actually founded by two women, queer women, and I'm friends with both of them. Don't mean to name drop that way, but but I mean, when I discovered that party, and I remember just dancing on the dance floor to all this dabka music, and you're hearing like Nancy Ajram and Faraz Karam just going absolutely insane on the dance floor, and not have to worry about all these judgmental eyes looking at me like, who is this person, like I would at a wedding. Because there's a kind of music that we'll hear when we go to a wedding party with our cousins or extended family. And I feel like whenever I get, or even now, whenever I get back to Australia, I have to attend a wedding for someone, there's still someone who said, oh, inshallah, you're next, or that weird phrase, I forget what it's, some people know that phrase. That's the one, like, if I said it in my weird Aussie accent. Everyone always says that to me, and I was just like, oh, do I tell him? Do I not tell him? Or, you know. And so being in a space where I don't have to worry about that just really made me realize, oh, okay, I can be Arab, I can be gay, I can enjoy my life to the full in the community if I have to find this community. And I'm really lucky to find that in Sydney. And I mean, just for some context, like Sydney, I sometimes joke is like the Dearborn of the Southern Hemisphere, if you take out Latin America, because there's big Lebanese community in Western Sydney. And that's why there's that queer Arab party. So I think that was my first realization of what it was like to be queer and Arab together, and I think it was the first time when I started to realize, actually, I don't need to separate these two identities anymore. I don't need to be in a gay bar and just pretend to be this white passing dude with a strange name. Or Greek name. I used to pretend I was Greek. And I do have a Greek name, but I'm not Greek, which is a common phrase I say these days. Yes, and now I just tried to come to myself and say, actually, you know what, yeah, I'm Lebanese and Palestinian, and I'm Australian as well, and I'm gay. I can be all of these things at once and still be proud of who I am, still be proud to be gay, and still be proud to be Arab at the same time. There's no reason at all for me to separate the two. Sure, there's probably downsides to it, such as, you know, the homophobia in our community. I'm not going to deny that. But a lot of that is institutional, and a lot of that comes from colonial legacies. But that's another discussion for another time.
I think, I mean, really just building on what Elias was saying, when I was reading I got an advanced copy of, not to brag, of the book. And one of the contributors, Namir, he was talking about kind of his experience of living life in the hyphen. And actually that really struck me, because I'm Lebanese Palestinian, I'm also Scottish, I'm in the diaspora, I'm bi, and all of those kind of mixed hyphenate identities exist with a point of tension that Hassan talks about as this hyphen. And actually, I was really thinking about what it's like to live in that hyphen, and that finding, I think, a queer Arab community that you can celebrate all of those strange sliding identities that you thought were disparate and had to be separated by a big block actually can exist in that tension. And being able to connect with other people who similarly feel that sense of alienation or displacement, and realizing that there isn't any displacement if you're all connected. I hope that's not too cheesy. But
it isn't cheesy. And I think this anthology, one of the things it achieves is that sense of connectedness. So, it's time to bring in one of our other contributors who's coming via Zoom, Zeyn Joukhadar. Is Zeyn here?
I'm here.
Hey.
Hi. Can
Hey,
you hear me?
Zeyn. Nice to meet you. Nice to virtually meet you. Your piece actually follows on nicely from what you were just saying there. Your piece explores trans identity in the context not only of being an Arab, but also in the context of opera, which I found really fascinating. Why did you choose to write about this particular combination of identities and interests?
Well, I mean, I think like probably a lot of the other contributors, I'm very used to when it comes to talking about being trans, being Arab, being queer, being Muslim, there's often this expectation of a certain kind of explanation or a certain kind of justification, and a certain kind of, sort of putting one's trauma on display in a very particular way with a very particular narrative. And I'm frankly very bored by that narrative. And one of the things that I love about this anthology is that we didn't have to do that. That, Elias was very open with us, or at least definitely with me, about saying like, that's not what we're doing here. We can have different kinds of conversations here that normally, unfortunately get sort of occluded by the fact that we have to keep having these other conversations that are actually very basic. That frankly, I think a lot of us are ready to like move beyond. So when I started to think about like, well, what conversation could I have with other queer and trans Arabs that I normally don't get to have because there are other people in the room who want some kind of explanation from us? And I started to think about what I was going through in that moment, which was I was, and I'm still doing this, but I was taking voice lessons regularly for the first time in many, many years, because my voice was dropping, and I was sort of reigniting my love for music. And trying to be in my body in a different way and be present with music in another way. But I was having all of this stuff come up about, yes, I love singing. Yes, I love opera. But at the same time, I have a lot of problems with opera, like a lot of sort of cultural things that I would like to enjoy, but they come with racism. They come with Orientalism. They come with homophobia, with transphobia. And so I was just started to think about that as, yes, I could talk about opera. I could talk about a lot of things, right? As a sort of way of into this discussion of the intersection of all of these things, and to say, how can we love something and also criticize it? And maybe we can criticize it because we love it, and also sometimes there seems to be very little room for our anger. And I hadn't been able to have a lot of these conversations with other, let's say, other singers or other musicians about, yes, I love opera. And also, can we talk about all of the Orientalism in, 18th century Italian opera? Can we talk about brownface in opera houses around the world? Can we talk about Orlando, Virginia Woolf's Orlando, and the opening where I put the opening line in the essay, is he, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the fashion of the time did something to disguise it, was in the act of slicing at the head of a Moor which swung from the rafters. And I've never finished that book because that line bothers me so much. And so I wanted to maybe use some of these things to talk about how do we find a way in, and do we want to find a way in? Maybe there's some things that are just too painful. But if we want to at least have the conversation, I thought this may be a place where at least we can start to have some of those conversations, and I can have my joy, and I can also have my pain and maybe my anger too.
There's an assertiveness and a confidence about the collection, and certainly about your piece. At one point, you just referred there to the sadness. At one point in your essay, you described your various identities as a kind of constant failing. I found that profoundly moving. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I was specifically sort of talking about the intersection for me between my Arabness and my gender, in the sense that the gender binary was created for white bodies. And I'm not the first person to say that, of course. But, when I tried to sort of perform my gender in a certain kind of way, and I don't really do that anymore because of this sense of failure, I realized that the ways to signal masculinity were all tied to whiteness. And I just started to really experience on my body the way that I could never fully embody a gender that was legible to dominant culture, that would actually be true to me in a way that would be sort of, how do you say, read correctly or seen as successful in that way of like, oh yes, you're doing gender correctly. I would never be able to do that. Not only because I'm non-binary, but also because of my being non-white, because of my Arabness. And so at some point I just, decided that I didn't care to do that anymore. And to sort of embrace that quote unquote failure. Because for me, I definitely can relate to what you were talking about before about the sort of points of tension. And also at the same time, for me, I can only sort of embody or arrive to really like embrace and revel in my gender because of my Arabness. For me, there's actually no tension. For me, my sort of existence as an Arab, my racial identity and my gender identity, they make each other possible in a way that is sort of very specific to me. But I don't think I'm the only one, And so now that for me, I can sort of joke about like, yes, I understand that people think I'm sort of failing at gender. And I sort of also embrace that now because I'm not failing at embodying myself.
The final question is actually from one of the audience members, and it is, what tropes did you want to avoid when you began writing your essay?
Well, I mean, I was sort of, as I said before, I was sort of sick of talking about trauma in this certain kind of way, gender in a very specific way, trying to, justify myself or to somehow convey of the validity of who I am and the intersections at which I exist. I often get very tired of having those conversations because it's sort of, literally all of these identities coexist in my body, in my flesh all the time. So I don't feel there's any need to justify. And also I think that, I spent a lot of time rewriting this essay. I did want to talk about shame, but I wanted to talk about it in a way that wasn't sort of, my life is so difficult because of my transness or because of being my Arabness or whatever. I wanted to talk about the ways that the way my life is possible because of my intersecting identities, not the ways, not to sort of, play into that idea that somehow who I am makes my life harder. Maybe it makes it harder in terms of oppression, but also there's a feel gifts as a result of the intersections in which I exist. I am joyful to be who I am. I love being who I am. I wanted for that joy to be present in the essay too. Even when I was talking about things that maybe make me angry, even talking about opera, opera can make me angry, and maybe it makes me angry because I want to love it. Maybe sometimes there are things about the world that I get angry at because, I'm tired of having to be angry. I want things to change so that we can have more joy.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Zeyn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to stick with some of the audience questions, and for you guys, what did you have in mind when you were writing, and was it your younger self, friends, or other queer Arabs that you were thinking of as your reader? Who would like to go first?
Let me think. Gosh, that is a good question. It was other Arabs that I was trying to talk to, which I don't often get a chance to do in my time a novelist, but I don't actually write about the Middle East at all. I don't write about the Swana region. And so I was a bit nervous, actually, to have this opportunity to kind of have a conversation with people that I thought might understand where I'm coming from. Because a bit like Zeyn was saying, the opportunity to contribute to an anthology like this, in a sense, you're aware that there is a filter that's been lifted, that you're not performing for anyone else in the room who doesn't get it. And so I felt like I had a real responsibility to be as emotionally honest as I could be, which as a novelist I don't do very often because I make things up. And so actually it was, I found it quite hard, if I'm being honest. But that in itself, the process of finding it quite hard was very emotionally rewarding.
Can I ask you, just as a follow-up to that, because you write novels, have you written non-fiction sort of confessional pieces? No.
I've never done it. And in fact, I've been very resistant to it because I think, as Zeyn was saying, there is this trope of kind of performing trauma and performing a certain narrative that is expected of you, specifically as a Palestinian, where, I don't know, speaking personally, I feel that there is certainly a hunger for these kind of specific trauma narratives or diasporic narratives about feeling displacement. And I don't want to perform that for an audience of people who aren't going to get it. It feels a bit cheap. And this felt like a really heartfelt and emotionally true opportunity to do that for the first time. So thank you, Elias, for inviting me.
Obviously, I didn't write any of the chapters in the book, but I did. When I was putting it together, I was thinking of queer Arab readers and the queer community across the Arab world and the diaspora, purely because I felt like, this was something that I wish I could have had when I was growing up as a teenager, just to see myself in the pages like this. I don't know. I mean, when I approached all the contributors, all the potential contributors, wanted to tell them about this book that I'm putting together, I would love them to be a part of. I made it clear to them, like, I want you to feel like the microphone is yours and yours only. There's no one in the room. Just write about, like, just speaking to this microphone on your own, share your own personal story. As Anbara's touched on, as Zeyn's touched on, like, I don't want anyone to feel like they had to explain themselves. I didn't want anyone to feel like they had to sort of pander to a certain narrative or pander to a certain, trauma porn that so many people expect of us, of our community, and I feel like that sort of narrative seems to be the only time, or the majority of the times, when we seem to get any attention. So I want to sort of flip that narrative, challenge that, and sort of say, look, this is who we are. We're creating our own space, and we're telling our stories our own way. I was thinking of readers when I was putting the book together, and I wanted the reader to think that that there's so many different ways to be queer and Arab at the same time. There's no right or wrong way. There's no rule book. You don't have to follow the lifestyle of what you see in the West, going out in pride marches all the time. You can still be your true self, whether you're out the closet or in the closet or somewhere in between, no matter where you are on the journey. But at the same time, that no one should ever feel like they have to explain themselves or prove themselves to be part of their community, because you are who you are. That's it, full stop. In addition to that, I want readers to feel like that there is a community out there. There are people like them out there, if someone in a random town, isolated town, doesn't know anyone else in the community who they can reach out to, if they just pick up the book and say, oh, okay, if they can feel that connection, then I feel like, that serves the purpose of the book. But yeah, I feel like I'm giving you a long-winded answer, Paul. Sorry.
You've actually answered my next question. So that was very clever. Now, my next question was going to be, what do you hope that this book will achieve? I mean, to me, it feels like the opening of a conversation.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I tell people all the time, like, I don't want people to feel like this is the one and only definitive collection. I hope there are other books like this that come out afterwards. I don't want to be the editor of it. I think that the platform. I mean, it's not that I don't want to. It's just the reason why I say that is because I feel like that platform needs to be shared amongst the community. There's no one person who should be doing it the whole time. So if other books come out of this and the more people share their stories, then I'll know that, okay, my job's been done here. So that's what I hope to achieve out of it. And I do hope to achieve some more nuanced discussion around our community, and discussions where we get to speak for ourselves rather than have people speak over us or speak for us or above us. Because that's one of the other reasons why I put this book together, because I mean, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons was when I was in Australia with editor Stubbs over the queer publication there. I felt really limited in being able to represent my community through the shoestring budget we had. And one of the things I noticed is, I'll talk about it in my introduction, is when I was editor, there was a lot of headlines about ISIS throwing gay men off the tops from in Iraq and Syria. And I just remember being the editor of Stubbs, I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I can't even, I'm republishing wild stories about this, and I feel like I was not making any difference whatsoever. I just felt like so disconnected from it all, but at the same time so frustrated I couldn't make a difference from afar. And but having said that, even though I was in queer media and with the limited budgets the limited resources we had, just seeing everyone else in the mainstream society talk about that headline thing just really made me feel icky, because there's a lot of underlying, sometimes blatant Islamophobia and racism, and there were people just constantly disregarding the full nuances of why this is happening. So I'm under no circumstances am I condoning what ISIS did. That's just what they're effing awful. But at the same time, like, you know, things that just didn't come out of the blue. These things, a lot of things led up to that, and people in wider mainstream society didn't seem to realise they don't want to acknowledge that. They just think, oh, the Arab world, they've got their own problem. But, well, half the problem we have is because of the West, you know. So, I think if we're going to have a nuanced discussion about a community, we do need to talk about Western intervention, the history of Western intervention in the area, and how that sowed the seeds for a lot of Islamophobia, transphobia and homophobia, and that's been state sanctioned and also brutally enforced in many cases. So I'm giving you a long-winded answer again, Paul, sorry. But yeah, did I answer your question? So.
You did indeed. One of your stablemates, one of the other people published by your esteemed publisher is the wonderful Joelle Taylor, who just won the T.S. Eliot Prize. And I was at an event with her a few weeks ago, and we did an interview afterwards, and she said something very interesting about her role as a writer-performer, but also as a mentor. And she said that the pen isn't just a pen, and the microphone isn't just a microphone. They're both batons that you pass on to the next person, which I thought was a beautiful way of summing it up. It seems to me that this book, in a way, is a baton as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I just hope that I do definitely want to pass it on and definitely start wider discussions, more nuanced discussions about our community. So, yeah.
I think it's time to bring in our final guest, Mona Eltahawy. Eltahawy, is that correct? Sorry, pronunciation. Sorry, is Mona with us? Hello, Mona.
Yes, I am. Hello.
Hello. Welcome.
Thank you.
I read your piece, and it's incredibly arresting. The opening line, no spoilers, the very opening line of the piece is, I'm writing this almost exactly 10 years after I died. It's the first piece in the anthology, and it's a very impactful way to start a very impactful book. Can you tell us why you chose to write this piece, and what made you decide to open it in such a provocative way?
Right. Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone there. I wish I was there with you, and I'm with you in spirit, and I hope everyone reads this really revolutionary book. So as I explained in my essay, a little over 10 years ago, it's 11 years ago now, Egyptian riot police, during a now iconic protest that took place over 5 days very near Tahrir Square in Cairo. This was November 2011. Egyptian riot police broke my left arm and my right hand and sexually assaulted me. And their supervising officer threatened to have me gang raped. And I was held for 6 hours incommunicado by the Interior Ministry and another 6 by military intelligence, who blindfolded and interrogated me. And as awful as all of that, I'm lucky to be alive. And I'm lucky to be alive for many reasons. At least 40 people were killed during those 5 days of protest, and more than 300, including myself, were wounded. But I'm lucky to be alive because of who I am, because people know me and they follow me on social media, and I have a massive following. I'm also lucky to be alive because I'm a dual citizen of Egypt and the US. I'm not an anonymous working class Egyptian woman. And had I been, I most likely would have been, I could have been gang raped and I could have been killed. So it was very true. I mean, I've heard several of the other contributors say they didn't want to write trauma, but I did write trauma because that's what happened to me. And that trauma, and I'm sure everyone has various traumas that have happened to them, but I chose to write about that trauma as something that liberated me, as something, and I say that I'm writing this after I died, because kind of like the analogy that I'm drawing is that what happened to me killed the Mona I used to be. And I'm very grateful for her for bringing me to that moment, for being who she was. But she died and she bequeathed me what I say are her silences. And she said, I've died so that you can go now and speak for us both everything that I have been unable to say until now. And so I've spent the past decade doing what the title of the essay is, basically the decade of saying all that I could not say. And I ask myself again and again, am I brave? And this question of courage is really important to me because I believe that old Mona was courageous. She was courageous in many ways, most especially in the ways that she resisted the Mubarak regime and she reported on the Mubarak regime. She was a reporter in Egypt. I was a reporter in Egypt for 10 years and in other parts of the region. So I was definitely brave because I was taking on this awful regime, but I was brave in a very kind of political way that was very separate from the personal. And so I understood that when old Mona died and said, go and speak for us, the courage and the bravery that I needed to examine now, I kind of compare to muscles and working out, because I say that bravery and courage wilt when you're not exercising them. So this past decade has been me saying all the things I couldn't say. And every time I said something, it made it more urgent to say something even more brave, and so on and so forth. And so that's what I've been doing. And this essay, it sounds, I'm just going to say it. This essay is the bravest thing I've ever written. And now I want to know what now? You know, how now can I exercise my muscles of bravery?
The overwhelming feeling that I got from it was one of being not just a survivor, but being a thriver. To go from surviving to thriving is a really important part of that journey, and that comes across very strongly in your essay.
Thank you. I think, you know, so I did talk about trauma. I talk about a lot of pain. I explain it as a way of dying, but I explain it, you know, as a way of dying in a kind of like the ways that cultures that have reincarnation imagine death, that it's not an end. It's part of a cycle. And I use the image of nesting dolls in that I compare every kind of brave thing that I say to smashing one nesting doll and then finding another more intense version of myself in the next version of the nesting doll that needs to say something braver. So that is a kind of like what you're saying, thriving, exploring, evolving, being liberated. If anything, I hope that people who read my essay get the sense of liberation. I have deliberately liberated myself, and I've liberated myself by saying all that I could not say. The things I could not say were holding me hostage, and I am now free. So what next?
Am I right in thinking that you're going to read something for us? Is that correct?
If you'd like. I wasn't
Yes,
sure what the time was like.
I think we've got time for reading, haven't we? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So this is from The Decade of Saying All That I Could Not Say. It took Ireland and Bosnia to force a reckoning with my nesting dolls of secrets. Of all the countries I have traveled to for work in the Western world, I've always felt most understood in Ireland. Unlike many other European countries which prefer to deny and distance themselves from talking about where I'm from, Egypt and the surrounding region, and say it's shit over there, Ireland understood it's shit over here too. The stranglehold of the Catholic Church on everything, from politics to education to geopolitics, fostered understanding and empathy whenever I spoke there. In 2015, Ireland became the first country to hold a referendum on marriage equality. The reckoning that such a referendum required inspired Ursula Halligan, one of Ireland's most high-profile journalists, to come out at the age of 54. At the time of writing, I am also 54. She wrote poignantly about a secret she thought she would take to her grave. Quote, I was a good Catholic girl, growing up in 1970s Ireland, where homosexuality was an evil perversion, she wrote. It was never openly talked about, but I knew it was the worst thing on the face of the earth. So when I fell in love with a girl in my class in school, I was terrified, end quote. Halligan's words gave me whiplash. When I was 16 years old, I was a good Muslim girl, growing up in Saudi Arabia where homosexuality was an evil perversion. I too fell in love with a girl in my class. But unlike Halligan, and this I now realize had been my denial and distance, I was in love with a girl and a boy at the same time, and thought everyone else was too. I didn't have a word for it, and I couldn't explore it beyond feeling jealous when the girl I was in love with told me she was in love with a boy, and crestfallen when she did not say I too was an object of her love. It would take another 3 decades until I kissed a woman, but tellingly, it would also take another decade until I kissed a man. At around the age of 17, I began having nightmares that I had married the wrong man. Even when, at the age of 21, I left gender-segregated Saudi Arabia for the more relaxed Egypt, my country of birth. I wanted very little to do with men. I was that good Muslim girl who was waiting for marriage, and much like Halligan, poured myself into work. When I read Halligan's coming out essay, I marveled at the almost identical teenage love for a girl, and I wondered how our journalism careers had helped us hide. I knew that I, at least, was hiding in plain sight. Was I brave? Of course I was. I wrote articles that exposed the human rights violations of a regime that tapped my phone, had me followed, summoned me for interrogation at state security several times, threatened to imprison me, and eventually made good on its threats that night on Mohammed Mahmoud Street in November 2011. Was I brave? Of course I was not. I couldn't say for the longest time that I desired men and women. How could I, when for the longest time men alone were off limits? How was I to figure out what I desired when desire for anyone was off limits? I'm going to skip for a bit now because I don't want to read too long. I'm just going to read the final section of an excerpt that I've published so that others can read if they're going to. The liberatory and revolutionary potential of queerness became especially poignant for me when I first visited Sarajevo in 2016. I went to Vilna-Vlas Hotel and Spa, which had been used as the largest rape concentration camp during the Bosnian War, and to Srebrenica, site of the worst massacre in modern European history. The previous night, I had been to a queer club in the Bosnian capital with queer friends. It was a small club that played a mix of Western pop and dance songs, along with domestic folk dance music. The club was packed, mostly with men who frequently kissed. I held on to those images, the men kissing all around me as I danced with my friends. The next day, as I reeled at the atrocities that had been committed in the places I visited. The queerness I carried out of that radical space of openness and the transgressive sexualities that surrounded me were the perfect antidote to the horror of militarism that had been unleashed at Vilna-Vlas and Srebrenica. Men should kiss each other more often and kill less, much less. One of those men in the queer club in Bosnia kissed me. I'm bisexual, he told me. So am I replied.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Mona. Thank you very much. Thanks for contributing this evening. And finally, Anbara is going to read something from your piece.
Yeah, that's not at all terrifying follow-up. Thanks for that. That's really appreciate going last. That's great. Hi, okay, so my piece is called Unheld Conversations. I'm just going to read some of it because no one likes to listen to somebody read for too long. Okay, so just before my second, I write books, which I already mentioned. Just before my second novel was published in 2020, I gave each of my parents an advance proof copy. So this is my second book. It's called Belladonna. They both read my first novel at a much earlier stage in the publishing process, but this time I only gave it to them just weeks before it was being made available to the public. Now, it's far from an autobiographical book. It's set in the 1950s in northern Italy, which is a place I've never even been. Did I say silent convent? It's also set in a silent convent. But unlike my first novel, Belladonna it's in the first person, and it's narrated by a young queer Arab woman. And it's about the kind of pain and toxicity that the narrator experiences as a result of their longing for another woman, and the plot revolves around a love triangle between three women. So it is a very queer book. And so as I handed over the soon-to-be published book to my parents, it was with a kind of certain amount of anticipation and trepidation. I left them to read the book and waited for the conversation about my sexuality that we never actually had. And they both read the book, and then we never had a conversation. So the special kind of flavor of disappointment that I felt is quite hard to express. It was as if a kind of taxing and baroque examination being cancelled at the last minute. The terror of facing this confrontation had been removed, but the fight music was playing, but the match had been cancelled. So I went over the reasons in my head why we might not talk about the book. We'd had lots of conversations about my first novel, which is about missionaries in the South Pacific. Lots of conversations about which parts were real, which parts were imagined. This is a common frustration for novelists, and in fact, Danny Ramadan, she talks about this a lot. And in fact, reading that piece, I thought was really, really interesting. So friends and family get a particular kind of validation of sifting through your work for nuggets of what's real and what's imaginary. And actually, it becomes really frustrating. So why was I so preoccupied by the lack of interrogation about my second book? It was hypocritical and narcissistic of me to suddenly want other people to battle out the dividing line between, my authorial voice and my real life experience. My straight friends were particularly confused by my distress, so surely it's a good thing that my parents had avoided a conversation about queerness. The book was out, no one had said anything, which they encouraged me to take as a tacit form of acceptance, if not approval. I was in a relationship with a man at the time, so they reasoned why was it even bothering me. I felt a kind of gathering accusation that I was experiencing a kind of millennial, self-indulgent sort of angst about a harmless form of erasure. But in a large, rowdy, nosy Arab family, change in hairstyle is a fodder for teeth-sucking, cigarette-waving phone chains. Every minor life decision, every petty complaint about a colleague, every pound of weight fluctuation is passed between an extended network of loved ones who make it their personal mission to frolic in your business. But apparently my identity wasn't worth a fuss. I'd expected a fuss, and I was owed a fuss. Withheld conversations about queer identity are an integral, load-bearing part of Arab culture. And for many queer Arabs, these withheld conversations serve us. They serve us structurally by providing shields that for many people actually save lives from legal and social censure. They invite convenient amnesia, avert judicious eyes, swallow tarts at the back of the throat. They form a screen around particular bars in Beirut, bookshop in Cairo. Thanks to these withheld conversations, our relationships with our grandparents can continue with a manageable amount of intergenerational disorientation. And the absence of conversation about queerness is the best case scenario for those who are unable to offer acceptance. The most they can do is clear a blank space on the map and stand at the edges, looking the other way. In the diaspora, unheld conversations about sexuality are tangled up with other forms of discourse about identity. I'm one of those diasporic Arabs who enjoys special privilege from being benefits of these overlapping silences, something that produces, as it does with all privileged people, miasma of guilt and self-doubt, nauseating, tedious self-analysis that has in danger of resulting in heavy-handed poetry about pomegranate seeds. But the particular grotesque kind of identity twist is where straight passing meets white passing, and as a pale and unaccented Palestinian, well, I do have an accent, obviously, but not an Arab accent, living in the UK, I've had access to spaces where it has been, a pleasure to kind of rip off the cloak and challenge people on their unfiltered racism and their homophobia. But I have also sat in that cloak complicitly and said nothing. The eldest daughters of Arab families are expected to uncomplainingly contain the emotional needs of others and quietly manage the practical labor of caretaking. Requires being a vessel into which responsibilities are poured. You must become a resting place for squabbles, disappointments, and frustrations. You have to be a bridge between generations. The eldest daughters of Arab families are expected to shelve our whims, keep our personalities confined so not to use up emotional resources needed elsewhere. We're not supposed to be unusual or unexpected. It's a role expected to be performed in silence. Avoidance is a learned tactic. It comes from experience. It's honed over time, and we create grooves to fall into, grooves that hold us in place to avoid collision. Most of the Arab families I know are enthusiastic about emotional squabbles, operatic altercations, overblown, multicolored disagreements with labyrinthine subplots. But true confrontation has consequences. It exposes and it reveals. Since the risks of those revelations outweigh the rewards, silence is simpler until it becomes habitual. So while I was reflecting on this, I was kept returning to this memory of my mother. When I was about 10, I must have been end of primary school, and one day at the end of school, I could see through the window my mother in the playground, and I could see even from afar that her face was stormy. So I dawdled in the corridor, sensing danger, and then I spotted it in her hands, my diary. So this is one of those sort of flimsy lock and key contraptions much beloved by primary school girls in the 1990s, promising a loyal confidant and a reliable companion in which I could inscribe my hopes and dreams, which I did not. But that day, looking at the sort of smashed lock mechanism in my mother's grip, I recalled with horror and shame the secrets that I'd spelled so poorly within. Maths test I'd cheated on, and a scarf I'd stolen from the lost property box. Wielding the diary, my mum marched to the supervising teacher and demanded that I confess all of my latent crimes on the spot, or she'd read aloud from the diary and expose me as a criminal. So I confessed, and it was a very tearful journey home. And as an adult, I can recognize this as a very, very unnecessary moment of public parental theater. And it was certainly intrusive in a way that rendered me paranoid for years. I've never kept a diary since then. But I also recognize the determined interest that it took to smash through a lock on the book of my secrets. It's the same level of determination that it now takes to look away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank also Mona and Zeyn, but please give it up for these wonderful people up here today. There will be a book signing, so please return to the bar and get your book signed. The books are £10 only, is that correct? For one night and one night only. Get them while they're hot. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.